I think it's time everyone meets the real future of Caldwell Holdings. Christopher's voice carried smoothly across the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above us. The Manhattan skyline glowed beyond the tall windows, like it was applauding him. Then he reached for her hand. Madison Reed, 29, Harvard MBA, sharp white dress, confident smile. This, he continued, pulling her closer, mine is the mind that's actually driving our next billion-dollar expansion. A few investors chuckled. I stood beside him in a navy silk gown, suddenly invisible in a room that once belonged to my father's legacy. Christopher didn't look at me when he added, lightly, almost playfully, "Tori prefers charity luncheons and book clubs. High finance was never really her thing." More laughter. Someone lifted a champagne glass. Someone else whispered, "Poor thing." I felt the heat climb my neck, but I didn't move. Madison gave me a polite smile. Not cruel, just unaware. She truly believed I was ornamental. The photographer snapped a photo. The flash burned. Christopher leaned in closer and said under his breath, "Just for me. You should be grateful I still let you stand up here." Let me. The word echoed louder than the applause. Across the ballroom, I noticed Arthur Bennett near the marble column, watching carefully. He didn't clap. Neither did two board members. Christopher raised his Mont Blanc pen dramatically as he signed a preliminary agreement folder on the cocktail table, a symbolic gesture for the investors gathered around. Applause filled the room again. He thought this was his coronation. He thought tonight erased my father's shadow. He thought I had no power left. But what he didn't know, what no one in that glittering room understood, was that a single clause buried inside a trust agreement, signed the night my father died, and could undo everything he had just celebrated. And in less than 10 days, this same ballroom would remember my name for a very different reason. Because Christopher Caldwell had just made the biggest mistake of his career. And he did it in front of everyone. 6 months before the gala, life was quieter. No crystal chandeliers. No polite laughter echoing through marble halls. Just the steady, distant murmur of traffic drifting up from Central Park to our penthouse windows. Christopher stood facing the glass. The city stretched out beneath him like something he already owned. The lights of Manhattan reflected in the window, blending with his silhouette. In his hand, a glass of scotch caught the amber glow of the room. "We're playing too small," he said, almost to himself. "This market rewards bold moves." I eased my MacBook shut, though the numbers were still running through my head. Debt ratios, liquidity strain, the exposure in overseas positions that felt unstable if even one variable shifted. "It's not about playing small," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "It's about not gambling everything at once. If the market tightens, even a little, we'll feel it." He let out a breath that sounded more impatient than thoughtful. "That's fear," he said. "It's discipline." When he turned, there was a smile on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been away from operations for a long time, Tori. Hosting fundraisers isn't the same as navigating corporate combat." Combat. The word settled between us like something sharp. Before Christopher ever had an office in our building, I had spent late nights beside my father, reviewing balance sheets and expansion plans. I knew where the vulnerabilities were buried. I also knew where the safeguards lived, structures designed quietly, intentionally. After my father passed, those late nights disappeared. First, I was excluded from strategy sessions, then from executive briefings. Eventually, decisions simply happened without me. "I have a meeting next week," Christopher continued, swirling the ice in his glass. "Private equity. They move quickly." "Who approved that conversation?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "I'm the CEO." It wasn't confidence I heard. It was separation. Later, when the apartment was dark and still, I stepped into his office. Papers lay stacked neatly on his desk. A Mont Blanc pen rested on top of draft agreements, ready for signatures. I didn't touch a thing. Instead, I opened the secure folder on my laptop, the family trust documents. My father had insisted on a contingency clause. Protection, he'd called it. Insurance against reckless leadership. Back then, I thought he worried too much. Now I wondered if he had worried just enough. The next morning, Christopher left before sunrise, sliding into his Mercedes S-Class with barely a glance back. As the elevator doors began to close, he said lightly, "Don't stress over things outside your depth." The doors shut. I remained in the hallway long after the engine noise faded, because what he didn't realize was simple. He wasn't stepping beyond my understanding. He was stepping directly into it. And I had already begun to move in silence. The first sign wasn't anything dramatic. No lipstick stains. No secret calls in the middle of the night. It was something smaller than that. Almost ordinary. A password. On a quiet Monday morning, when I sat down with my coffee and tried to log into the executive dashboard, the same one I had helped build years ago with my father. My fingers moved automatically. I knew the login by heart. The screen paused. Then it refreshed. Access denied. I waited, thinking I'd mistyped something. I tried again. Same result. For a few seconds, I just stared at the words. It felt strange, like walking up to your own front door and realizing the key no longer fits. I called the office downstairs. The voice on the other end was polite, careful. "Mrs. Caldwell, access permissions were updated under the CEO's direction." Updated. I thanked them and ended the call. My hand felt colder than it should have. That afternoon, Christopher came home later than usual. He looked energized, almost pleased with himself. There was a faint scent of cologne I didn't recognize. Nothing obvious, just unfamiliar. "How was your day?" I asked. "Productive," he said, loosening his tie. "No, we're making real progress." We. But somehow, I wasn't included in that word anymore. Later, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to snoop. It was just there. Madison Reed. The message preview showed a single line. "The investors loved your vision today. Dinner at the River Cafe is set. Your vision." I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't scroll. I didn't need to. 2 days later, I came across a short article online through a rumor about Caldwell Holdings taking on aggressive leverage to fund expansion. My stomach tightened as I read the details. I knew that structure. I knew how fragile it could become if the market shifted. He hadn't mentioned any of it to me. That night, I opened an old administrative login my father had once insisted we keep active, just in case. It still worked. Inside the internal registry was a draft restructuring document, and in the fine print, almost hidden, was a clause about diluting non-active voting shares during expansion phases. Non-active. That was me. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle. This wasn't just about growing the company faster. It was about slowly, carefully stepping around me. And I realized, with a clarity that almost hurt, that this had probably been happening longer than I wanted to admit. The headline went live at 6:12 a.m. I know the exact time because I was already awake. Is Caldwell Holdings losing its founding vision? It sat there on the screen, calm and polished, published by one of those Manhattan financial blogs investors skim before their first coffee. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that plants doubt quietly. There was a photo. Christopher at the podium, confident as ever. Madison just behind him, attentive, poised. And me, barely visible at the edge, half my shoulder. No name in the caption. I read the piece slowly. It never accused anyone outright, It didn't need to. It questioned leadership clarity. It referenced internal restructuring. It suggested that legacy influence might be slowing necessary modernization. Legacy influence. That was the polite way of saying I was outdated. By 8 o'clock, the link was circulating among investors. By 9:30, 2 board members had emailed asking for clarification about our exposure levels. Christopher didn't call me. He called the PR team. When he came home that night, he looked composed, almost bored. "It's just noise," he said, setting his briefcase down. "Competitors trying to stir uncertainty." I handed him my iPad without a word. "They're quoting internal restructuring language," I said. His expression shifted for half a second. Then it was gone. "Draft documents get taken out of context all the time." "Or shared intentionally," I replied. He held my gaze, measuring. "We need to present a united front," he said finally. "What, now more than ever?" United. Earlier that day, 3 women I'd known for years had texted me. "Are you stepping back? He seems to be taking over everything." "Are you okay?" I answered politely. I always do. But something inside me had gone still. This wasn't only about passwords or voting shares anymore. It was about the story being told. Christopher wasn't pushing me out loudly. He was editing me out. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room. The city lights flickered beyond the glass, steady and indifferent. I opened the trust documents again. Slower this time, the clause my father insisted on. Activation triggered by demonstrable strategic endangerment. Not disagreement. Endangerment. My phone buzzed. Arthur Bennett. "Have you seen the article? We should talk tomorrow." I read it twice. Arthur never overreacted. If he was reaching out, this wasn't gossip. Something had shifted. And whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to stay subtle. The story didn't fade the way I hoped it would. It spread. By the following morning, bigger outlets had picked it up. The language became sharper, more confident. Commentators talked about shifts in authority and unclear governance. On television, strangers debated the future of a company my father built from nothing. No one said my name. They didn't need to. At breakfast, Ethan sat across from me, a sunlight catching in his hair as he scrolled through his tablet. "Mom," he said, not looking up at first. "Do you still work at the company?" The question was simple, curious. It shouldn't have hurt. "Of course I do," I answered, reaching for my mug so he wouldn't see my hesitation. "Why would you think I don't?" He glanced up then. "A kid at school said his dad read that Grandpa's company is changing, that Dad's in charge of everything now." In charge of everything. I nodded slowly, as if that version of the story made sense. "Businesses evolve," I said. "That doesn't mean people disappear." He watched me in that steady way children do, like they're measuring what you say against what they feel. "I just think Grandpa trusted you," he said quietly. I smiled. I think I did. But after he left for school, the kitchen felt too large, too silent. The city outside moved like it always does. Cabs, pedestrians, steel and glass catching the morning light. Nothing about it reflected the quiet shift happening in my own home. My phone vibrated on the counter. A board member. "Christopher will present the revised expansion plan on Friday. Would you like to join virtually?" Like, as if my presence were a preference, not a position. I replied with one sentence. "I will attend in person." Later that afternoon, another piece was published. This one mentioned equity adjustments and inactive voting interests. Inactive. The word again. I understood what was happening. Not an attack. Not yet. It was something slower, a narrative forming, brick by brick. That evening I pulled out my father's old leather notebook. The spine was worn. Inside the front cover, in his handwriting, was a single sentence. Control is never loud. It's structural. I traced the ink with my thumb. Then I called Arthur. Because waiting quietly is one thing. Letting yourself be erased is another. Arthur picked a place that didn't match the size of the conversation. No corner office, no private dining room with polished wood and discreet waiters. Just a narrow cafe on the Upper East Side, where the tables were too close together and no one looked up from their own lives. He was already there when I walked in, reading glasses sliding down his nose, a plain folder resting beside his coffee cup. "You look tired," he said, studying me over the rim of his glasses. I almost laughed. "But you don't look exactly rested either." Arthur had worked with my father for more than 2 decades. He was the kind of man who didn't raise his voice, didn't panic, didn't bend easily. Christopher had called his departure a modernization, a necessary shift. Arthur had simply packed his office and left. "I assume you've seen what's being written," he said. "Yes." "And the restructuring draft?" I nodded again. He pushed the folder toward me. Inside were printed projections, pages of numbers that told a story I already suspected. The growth looked impressive at first glance, but underneath, the risk was layered and heavy. Debt stacked on debt. Exposure stretched thin. "He's accelerating," Arthur said quietly. "If the market tightens even a little, cash flow compresses. When that happens, lenders start dictating terms. And we lose control," I said. He didn't need to confirm it. After a moment, he leaned back. "Your father worried about this exact scenario." I knew what he meant before he said it. "The clause," he continued, "strategic endangerment." Hearing it out loud made it feel less theoretical. "You believe it applies?" I asked. Arthur chose his words carefully. "If you can show that leadership is putting the company at measurable risk, yes. But it has to be clean. Documented. Not personal." Outside the window, taxis rolled past. People hurried by with shopping bags and coffee cups. The world felt unchanged. Christopher thought he was building something bigger. He didn't see the cracks forming underneath. Arthur closed the folder and looked at me directly. "If you decide to act, don't hesitate. Do it once. Do it properly." For months, I'd been absorbing every slight, every quiet exclusion. But this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about structure. As I stood to leave, Arthur added almost gently, "He thinks you're too emotional for this." I paused. That assumption might be the only advantage I needed. I wasn't meant to know about the dinner. It wasn't on the calendar we shared. He hadn't mentioned it in passing. It lived in that quiet space where plans are made carefully, deliberately, without certain people in the room. But at 4:18 that afternoon, an email confirmation slipped through to an old internal address that still forwarded to me. Private equity strategy. Dinner. The River Cafe, Christopher Caldwell. Madison Reed. A Sterling Crest Capital. 3 names. Mine wasn't one of them. The River Cafe wasn't a random choice. My father used to host serious investors there, the patient ones, the ones who cared about stability more than headlines. Seeing that location in black and white felt intentional, like Christopher was planting a flag. I didn't say anything when he came home. I watched him instead. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, smoothing his tie, checking the fit of his jacket. He looked confident, energized. "Working late?" I asked. "Just meetings," he said. "You'd be bored." I nodded. After he left, I gave it 10 minutes. Then I grabbed my coat. The River Cafe was glowing when I arrived, the skyline shimmering across the water. Through the window, I saw them before they noticed me. Christopher leaning in, hands moving as he spoke. Madison beside him, engaged, eager. 2 men across the table listening carefully. He looked completely at ease. I walked in, when the host recognized me immediately. Surprise flickered across his face, but he didn't question it. Christopher saw me as I approached. He stood halfway, smile already forming. "Victoria." "I didn't realize. I was nearby," I said evenly. "And since this concerns Caldwell Holdings, I assumed I should be here." The table went quiet. One of the investors glanced between us. We understood leadership was streamlined. "Yes," I replied. "Team, that's the narrative." Christopher's expression hardened just slightly. "This is preliminary," he said. "I'm sure," I answered, placing a single page on the table, a highlighted section of the trust agreement. "Which is why clarity matters." The men read it. Slowly. "Majority voting authority. Strategic endangerment review." No one spoke for a moment. I didn't argue. I didn't stay long. I simply let the information settle. Outside, the night air felt sharp against my skin. My phone buzzed before I reached the car. Arthur. "That didn't take long," he said. No, it didn't. Christopher had wanted to move without me. Now his potential partners knew that wasn't possible. And that changes everything. The morning after the dinner, Christopher moved through the kitchen like nothing had happened. He wasn't cold. He wasn't loud. He was composed. He stood at the counter scrolling through financial headlines, while the espresso machine hissed in the background. The quiet between us felt deliberate, like he was choosing every breath. "You blindsided potential partners," he said at last, still looking at his phone. "I corrected the narrative," I answered. That made him glance up. "You're destabilizing negotiations." "I'm protecting the company." The words sat between us, sharp and clean. Same space, different realities. By midday, I saw his response. An internal memo went out to senior leadership announcing a strategic voting adjustment designed to streamline fast growth acquisitions. The language was polished, almost reassuring. Buried in the attachment was the real objective: temporarily suspending inactive voting shares during expansion cycles. Temporary. It sounded harmless, if you didn't understand how temporary can quietly become permanent. At 2 o'clock, my inbox chimed again. Emergency board meeting. Friday morning. Approval of the revised expansion framework. He wasn't backing down. He was speeding up. Arthur came to see me later that afternoon, entering discreetly through a side elevator. He placed updated projections on my desk. The numbers were more aggressive than before. Higher leverage, narrower margins. "He's pushing this through before anyone has time to dissect it," Arthur said. "Can he do that?" I asked. "He can try, well, unless someone forces a procedural review." Sterling Crest was ready to invest, but only if governance concerns were resolved, meaning me. Then my phone buzzed, a message from Madison. "I honestly didn't know about that clause. He never told me." I read it twice. There it was. Uncertainty. Christopher believed he had boxed me in, painted me as emotional, obstructive, a relic. But in his rush to secure control, he'd made one mistake. He left a trail. Emails, memos, projections, timestamps, proof. That night, I drafted a formal notice invoking review under the Trust's strategic endangerment provision. I didn't hit send. I scheduled it instead. Friday, 9:02 a.m., 2 minutes before the board convened. If he wanted momentum, he was going to get it, just not in the direction he expected. Friday came faster than I was ready for. I stood in my closet longer than usual, running my hand over familiar fabrics before choosing a charcoal suit I hadn't worn in years. The last time I had it on was beside my father at a shareholder meeting. I remember how steady he looked that day. I needed some of that steadiness now. Christopher was already in the kitchen when I walked in, calm, focused, like this was just another morning. "You don't need to sit through this," he said casually. "It's procedural." "I'm aware," I answered. "So am I." The drive downtown was quiet. He skimmed emails on his phone while the car moved through traffic along Park Avenue. I watched the buildings pass by, their glass catching the light. I tried to slow my breathing. When we stepped onto the executive floor, conversations softened. A few board members looked mildly surprised to see me. Others gave polite nods, unsure. Christopher handed out printed summaries of his expansion plan, confident as ever. The pages looked clean, convincing, ambitious. At 9 sharp, everyone took their seats. He began speaking almost immediately, voice smooth, practiced. And growth projections, market positioning, opportunity. At 9:02, my phone buzzed once against the table. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. Across from me, Arthur glanced up. Just a small nod. A few seconds later, one tablet chimed, then another. Christopher hesitated mid-sentence. Is something wrong? A board member cleared his throat. We've just received a formal governance notice. The air shifted. You could feel it. Christopher looked confused, just for a moment. What notice? I folded my hands in front of me. A request for procedural review under fiduciary standards. Silence followed. Not dramatic, just heavy. The same documents that had seemed bold a minute earlier now looked complicated. Risky. This delays progress, Christopher said, more tightly now. It ensures we understand the risk, I replied. Arthur began calmly outlining debt exposure and covenant triggers. Clear. Measured. For the first time in a long while, Christopher wasn't leading the conversation. He was answering questions. The vote he expected didn't happen. Instead, there was a pause. And sometimes, a pause changes everything. The meeting didn't end the way Christopher expected. No quick vote. No smooth approval. Instead, the questions started. Not the usual surface-level ones he handled so easily during quarterly calls. These were detailed. Patient. Focused on leverage exposure, debt covenants, worst-case scenarios. I saw it then. A flicker. A pause before he answered. One director leaned forward. Why weren't these leverage ratios included in the initial summary? Christopher adjusted his tie, buying half a second. They fall within acceptable range based on projected growth. Projected, the director repeated, almost thoughtfully. Arthur slid a document across the table. Under a stress test, with even a minor market contraction, covenant pressure increases quickly. No one rushed to fill the silence that followed. It wasn't loud. It was heavier than that. Christopher didn't lose control, but his voice sharpened. This is how companies scale, he said. If we hesitate every time there's risk, we'll be left behind. And if the risk isn't theoretical? Another board member asked. That landed differently. I stayed quiet. There was nothing to add. The numbers were clear enough. Then Mr. Langford, who had served on the board since my father's early years, looked directly at me. Victoria, he said, steady as ever. Are you formally invoking the strategic endangerment provision? Every face turned in my direction. Christopher's eyes met mine. No smirk this time. No dismissal. Just tension. My pulse was steady, surprisingly so. Yes, I said. I am. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt necessary. Mr. Langford nodded once. Then under the trust agreement, voting authority is suspended, pending an independent audit. The word suspended seemed to echo longer than it should have. Christopher leaned back slowly. This is excessive. No, Langford replied. It's governance. The meeting dissolved after that. No raised voices, no applause, just quiet conversations and careful exits. Christopher left first, already dialing someone on his phone. For the first time since this began, he wasn't guiding the pace. He was trying to catch up to it. And once momentum shifts in a room like that, it doesn't quietly return to where it was. By Monday, what had happened in that boardroom wasn't private anymore. Well, the news broke before noon. Not dramatic, just a steady headline about governance tensions at Caldwell Holdings. The same commentators who had praised Christopher's bold strategy last week were now discussing oversight and risk exposure. The tone had changed. It wasn't sympathy for me, but it wasn't blind confidence in him either. Christopher responded quickly. A polished press release went out, full of phrases like alignment and standard review procedures. It sounded reassuring, almost routine. At home, nothing felt routine. "You set this in motion," he said that night, staring out the living room windows at the skyline. "I asked for transparency," I answered. "You made us look divided." "I made us accountable." He let out a tight laugh. "Markets reward conviction." "They punish failure," I said softly. He didn't argue after that. He stepped onto the balcony and made a series of quiet phone calls, his voice low but tense. The audit began the next morning. An external firm came in, methodical, neutral, unimpressed by titles. They requested everything: financial models, internal emails, draft agreements, communication with Sterling Crest. Nothing emotional about it, just records. And records tell their own story. By midweek, Madison asked if we could talk. She didn't look as certain as she had at the River Cafe. I didn't understand how tight the liquidity window was, she admitted. He said we had room. "We do," I said. "Just not if we sprint." She hesitated. "He said you were holding the company back." "I'm trying to keep it upright." She didn't push back this time. On Thursday, the preliminary findings circulated quietly among the board. The language was careful. Risk exposure elevated under stress conditions. Not disastrous, but concerning. Concern was enough. The vote remained suspended. No timeline announced. Christopher was still CEO. His title hadn't changed, but the energy in the building had. Conversations paused when he walked in. Messages were shorter, smiles more measured. Confidence had been replaced by caution. And once people start looking twice at decisions, they rarely go back to looking once. I had convinced myself the audit was the worst of it. I was wrong. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Arthur and I were sitting side by side, going over updated projections, when my phone vibrated. The message was from our family attorney. Urgent. "Please call." Something in my chest tightened before I even stepped out into the hallway. "There's been a filing," she said once I called back. Her voice was measured, careful. "Christopher has initiated a preliminary custody inquiry." I actually thought I'd misheard her. "A custody inquiry?" "He's not filing for divorce," she explained, "but he's requesting an evaluation, citing concerns about instability due to corporate stress." Instability. The word didn't feel legal. It felt personal. "He's questioning whether I'm fit to parent?" I asked. "He's positioning himself," she said gently. I ended the call and stood there staring at the blank wall. Boardroom battles were one thing. They were numbers, policies, clauses. This was different. That night, Christopher came home later than usual, calm, almost distant. "You're escalating this," I said when he walked into the kitchen. "I'm protecting Ethan," he replied without hesitation. "From what?" "From uncertainty." Uncertainty. As if I were the unstable element in his life. "You're using him," I said quietly. "I'm safeguarding him." Same tone, same polished language. But now it wasn't about leverage ratios. It was about our son. After he went upstairs, I stayed at the table long after the dishes were cleared. The city lights outside flickered against the glass. I thought about Ethan's laugh at breakfast, the way he leaves his backpack by the door, the questions he asks when he's trying to understand the adult world. There was nothing unstable about our home. There was tension, yes, but not instability. The next morning, I met with our attorney in person. We gathered everything: school reports, medical records, references, facts, documentation. "Stay steady," she told me. "Respond with clarity." I nodded. Christopher had decided to widen the fight. But when you pull your child into a strategy, it stops being a tactic. It becomes something else entirely. And that kind of move doesn't look strong under bright light. The auditors didn't waste time. By Thursday afternoon, Arthur asked me to meet him in a smaller conference room down the hall. The blinds were partly closed, muting the light from the city outside. He didn't look alarmed, just serious. "They flagged something," he said, sliding a printed email across the table. At first glance, it looked routine. The subject line read, "Liquidity Contingency Planning." Nothing unusual about that. Then I noticed the date. 2 days before the board meeting, Christopher had written directly to Sterling Crest. "If volatility escalates post-announcement, we may temporarily reallocate personal holdings to secure interim stability. Discretion appreciated." I read the sentence again, slower this time. Reallocate personal holdings. He had been preparing to move his own assets out of reach if the expansion triggered instability. Before the vote, before any formal approval. Arthur didn't rush me. It indicates he anticipated more risk than he presented publicly. "He built himself a safety net," I said quietly. "Yes." Oddly, I didn't feel anger, just clarity. This wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't even about humiliation at a gala or articles in the press. It was about awareness. He knew the risk profile, and he moved forward anyway. "If this is included in the review," Arthur added, "it shifts the narrative." That evening, I forwarded the email to our attorney and requested it be entered into the official governance file. When Christopher came home, he looked at me more carefully than usual. "You seem pleased," he said. "I'm paying attention," I replied. He studied me, as if trying to guess how much I knew. "You're reaching," he said finally. "That's standard contingency language." "Is it?" I asked. He didn't press further. Instead, he pivoted to something ordinary. Ethan's school event next week. A charity function on the calendar. Small talk layered over tension. Later that night, I opened the email again on my laptop. One phrase stood out more than the rest. Discretion appreciated. He hadn't just prepared for risk. He'd asked for quiet. But once something is written down, time-stamped and archived, it stops being a private precaution. It becomes a record. And records have a way of outlasting intention. The board set the final review for Monday morning. They didn't call it a vote. They called it a determination. That word lingered with me all weekend. By Sunday night, the apartment felt strangely still. Christopher stayed in his office with the door closed, voice low as he moved from one call to the next. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Steady, persuasive, controlled. Ethan was on the living room floor with a history book open in front of him. "Mom," he asked, eyes still on the page, "did Grandpa ever lose at anything?" I wasn't expecting that. In business?" I asked. "In general." I sat down beside him. "Yes," I said. "He lost plenty of times." "Then why does everyone act like he was unbeatable?" I smiled a little. "Because he didn't quit when he lost." Ethan looked at me more carefully then. "Are you going to lose tomorrow?" There's something about the way kids ask questions. No strategy, no angle, just honesty. "I'm not trying to win," I told him. "I'm trying to make sure things don't fall apart." He seemed to think about that. "I don't like when you and Dad are like this," he said softly. I wrapped my arm around him. "Whatever happens, we both love you. That part doesn't change." Later, after he went to bed, I went into my father's old study. The room still carried that familiar scent of paper and leather. I sat at his desk and opened the trust documents again, even though I already knew what they said. The clause was simple. If leadership knowingly put the company at serious risk, intervention was allowed. Christopher's email made that clear. I closed the folder and let the quiet settle around me. This wasn't about getting even. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about drawing a line. Close to midnight, Christopher appeared in the doorway. "You can still pull back," he said. I looked up at him. "No, I can't." There was no yelling, just a long silence between two people who understood that by morning, something would shift. And once trust changes shape, it rarely returns to what it was. Monday morning was painfully clear, the kind of bright Manhattan light that leaves no shadows to hide in. I arrived at the building alone. Christopher had already gone ahead. That felt symbolic somehow. The boardroom didn't buzz the way it usually did before big votes. No small talk. No nervous laughter. Just quiet focus. The auditor sat at the end of the table, screens open, papers lined up with careful precision. Arthur caught my eye as I sat down. Just a brief nod. Steady. Christopher walked in last. Calm. Collected. If anyone glanced at him quickly, they'd think nothing was wrong. The lead auditor began in an even tone. No drama, just facts. She explained the liquidity exposure under stress scenarios. Then she mentioned internal communications that suggested executive awareness of elevated risk before the board had been formally informed. The email appeared on the screen. Liquidity contingency planning. Discretion appreciated. And seeing those words projected large against the wall felt different than reading them alone at night. A director leaned forward. "Were you aware the leverage exceeded prior tolerance levels?" Christopher didn't rush his answer. "I was aware we needed flexibility. That doesn't mean the strategy was reckless." "And the plan to move personal holdings?" another asked. "Standard contingency planning." Arthur spoke quietly. "Nah, contingency planning not disclosed to the board." The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It felt settled, like everyone understood what they were looking at. Mr. Langford folded his hands. "We need to determine whether executive judgment met fiduciary standards." Christopher looked at me then, not with anger, not even frustration. He was searching for doubt. He didn't find it. The vote wasn't about expansion anymore. It was about leadership. One by one, hands went up. No one rushed. And when the count was finished, it was clear. Christopher was removed as acting CEO pending permanent replacement. No one clapped. No one argued. He stood slowly. "You're making a mistake," he said. "We're correcting one," I answered. He left without another word. The door closed, and the room, for the first time in weeks, felt steady. In Manhattan, nothing stays quiet for long. By lunchtime, the headlines had shifted. Caldwell Holdings, CEO, removed pending governance review. The coverage wasn't dramatic. No scandal language. Just analysis, speculation, careful commentary. Inside the office, the change was immediate. People who had kept their distance all week started stopping by, not with sympathy, not with celebration, with questions. What's our next move? Are we continuing operations as planned? Should we hold off on outside negotiations? They weren't looking for inspiration. They were looking for stability. Arthur came in that afternoon with a short outline. Tighten cash positions. Communicate clearly with investors. Pause any aggressive expansion. It wasn't flashy. It was responsible. No speeches. Just adjustments. Later, Christopher's attorneys released a statement suggesting the board had misunderstood his forward-looking strategy. Forward-looking. I almost smiled at that. Around 3, Madison appeared at my door. She looked smaller somehow, less certain than before. "I didn't know about the email," she said. "The one about moving personal assets." I figured. I told her. She sat down slowly. I thought we were just being ambitious. I didn't realize we were preparing for damage control. There was no defensiveness in her voice. You're smart, I said. Ambition isn't the problem. It's how you manage the risk that follows. She nodded and left quietly. That evening, I drove home by myself. Christopher's car wasn't in the garage. The apartment felt different when I walked in. Still, almost hollow. On the kitchen counter, there was an envelope with my name on it. Inside, just one line in his handwriting. This isn't over. I stood there for a long moment, holding the paper. Maybe he meant the legal fight. Maybe he meant us. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't feel the need to brace myself anymore. The board had made its decision. The audit findings were clear. The custody inquiry had stalled after initial review showed no cause for concern. The structure held. I walked to the window and looked out over the city. This didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance returning. And balance doesn't arrive with noise. It settles in quietly. Christopher didn't fade into the background. 2 days after the board removed him, he filed an appeal. His lawyers argued the audit had taken his emails out of context. They asked for reinstatement while a second review was conducted. He treated it like a delay, a technical setback. But this wasn't just paperwork anymore. By Friday afternoon, Sterling Crest pulled out. Their statement was short and careful, citing governance uncertainty. They didn't mention market volatility. They didn't blame timing. They questioned leadership. Inside the company, the mood kept shifting. Executives who once spoke about aggressive growth started using different words: stability, recalibration, long-term positioning. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. But it was there. Midweek, the board met again without Christopher in the room. Arthur walked them through the updated findings. The revenue projections had leaned heavily on best-case scenarios. The cushion against risk was thinner than it should have been. Nothing illegal, but risky in a way that couldn't be ignored. So at the same time, the custody inquiry quietly lost momentum. The evaluator found no instability at home, no cause for concern. That door closed without fanfare. By Thursday evening, the board made it official. Christopher would not return as CEO. He would keep his shares, but not the authority. He asked to see me privately. We met in the same room where the vote had taken place. He looked older somehow, tired. You didn't have to push this, he said. I didn't push, I answered. I responded. You've slowed everything down. I kept it from breaking. He let that sit between us. I built this momentum, he said more quietly. You managed it, I replied. You didn't own it. He paused at the door before leaving. So this is justice? I held his eyes. No, it's consequence. When he walked out, the room felt different. Not victorious, not triumphant, just settled. Because sometimes accountability doesn't arrive with noise, it arrives with finality. The announcement went out early Monday. Christopher wouldn't be returning as CEO. The board would oversee operations while they searched for someone permanent. At the bottom of the statement, my name appeared. Victoria Caldwell, acting chair. Seeing it in print felt strange, heavy, real. The media reaction wasn't dramatic this time. No dramatic music, no scandal headlines. Analysts spoke in calm tones about oversight and long-term stability. The words they used were measured. I didn't feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt tired. That afternoon, Madison asked to see me before turning in her resignation. She stood in my office doorway for a moment before sitting down. I was wrong about you, she said plainly. We were all moving fast, I answered. He made it sound like speed was the same as vision, she said. Sometimes it is, I replied, if you're prepared for the consequences. She hesitated, then added, "I didn't know about the custody filing. When I found out, it changed how I saw everything." I nodded. "It changed things for me, too." "I think I need to step away," she said. "That's your decision," I told her. "Just don't let this chapter define you." She left quieter than she'd arrived. That evening, I went to Ethan's school program. The room smelled faintly of glue and paper. Parents shifted in folding chairs. Children fidgeted on stage under bright lights. Ethan found me in the crowd and grinned. Afterward, when he slipped his hand into mine as we walked outside. "Is it over?" he asked. "It's calmer," I said. "That's what matters." He seemed satisfied with that. When we got home, several of Christopher's boxes were stacked neatly near the hallway. He'd be moving out by the end of the week. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just space forming where something used to be. I stood by the window, looking out over the city. This wasn't about winning. It was about holding steady when everything tries to tip. And sometimes, the biggest changes don't arrive with noise. They arrive with quiet certainty. 3 months later, the building looked exactly the same. Same glass tower, same skyline reflecting off its windows, same logo in the lobby. But inside it felt different. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume. We didn't rush into bold announcements or flashy acquisitions. We slowed things down, tightened cash reserves, reworked debt terms, spent long hours on calls with investors, answering questions without defensiveness. Some reporters described it as a cautious shift. To me, it felt like exhaling after holding my breath too long. People started stopping me in the hallway again. Not carefully, not awkwardly. "It feels steady now," one senior analyst said. Another added, "Thank you for not panicking." Steady. That word stayed with me. At home, the tension softened too. The divorce moved forward without drama. When Christopher settled into a condo downtown, we agreed on shared custody without another fight. The earlier evaluation made it clear. Ethan had always been fine. One Saturday, Ethan and I walked through Central Park. The air had that early fall crispness, leaves beginning to turn gold around us. "So are you the boss now?" he asked, nudging a pile of leaves with his shoe. "I'm the one responsible," I said. He glanced up at me. "Grandpa would think that's cool." I smiled. "I hope so." Later that week, I received a message from Lucas Miller. He'd competed against Christopher for years. "Stability isn't flashy," he wrote, "but it lasts. Coffee?" I stared at the message longer than I expected to. It didn't feel like strategy. It didn't feel like positioning. It felt open. That evening, back in my office, I looked at my father's photo on the shelf. The company was intact. My son felt safe. The noise that had filled every room a few months ago was gone. Christopher had been chasing speed. I chose something slower, stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was building forward. 6 months later, the skyline looked the same. But I didn't. Caldwell Holdings had stabilized. The audit recommendations were fully implemented. Cash reserves were stronger than they had been in years. Investor confidence returned quietly, not with applause, but with steady numbers. The board voted unanimously to confirm me as permanent chair. No ceremony, just acknowledgement. Christopher's appeal had long since dissolved. Without Sterling Crest, and without board support, momentum had shifted permanently. His new ventures were smaller, quieter. Ambition recalibrated. Our divorce finalized without spectacle. Shared custody became routine. Ethan adjusted with a resilience that humbled me. One evening, after a late meeting, I met Lucas for coffee. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't about leverage. It was easy. He didn't talk about market positioning or competitive edge. He asked about Ethan, about balance, about what I wanted next, not what I needed to defend. That question lingered longer than any board vote ever had. "What do you want now?" he asked. I looked out the cafe window at the city lights. "Peace," I said. And I realized I meant it. Weeks later, Lucas attended Ethan's school fundraiser with me. Not as a headline, not as a statement, just present. Ethan liked him. That mattered. Standing there, listening to children laugh under strings of simple white lights, I understood something I hadn't before. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't chase. It holds. Christopher believed power was acceleration. But acceleration without foundation collapses. I didn't win by shouting. I didn't win by revenge. I won by refusing to fall apart. The company stands. My son is secure. My name no longer trails behind someone else's title. And if there is one truth I carry forward, it's this. A smart woman doesn't argue for her place. She steps back, builds quietly, and returns at a level no one can remove. So, that's where her story comes to rest. And if you're still here with me right now, still listening, still thinking about everything that just unfolded, then something in this story touched you. Maybe it wasn't the boardroom drama. Maybe it wasn't the headlines. Maybe it was that quiet moment when she chose steadiness over revenge. Here's the truth we can carry into our own lives. Strength is not about reacting loudly. It's about responding wisely. It's about knowing your worth even when someone tries to rewrite your role. As Ayn Rand once wrote in her philosophy of rational self-interest, the question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me. Not in arrogance, but in clarity, in self-trust, in refusing to abandon your values just to keep peace. This story reminds us that protecting your foundation, your integrity, your children, your work is not selfish. It's responsible. Choosing stability over chaos, dignity over humiliation, is not weakness. It's maturity. So now I'll ask you gently, what in your life needs steadiness instead of speed? If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. We're building a space here for strong hearts and steady minds, and I'm really glad you stayed until the end. Before we close, I want to make something clear for transparency. This story is a work of fiction created for emotional storytelling and entertainment purposes. While it reflects realistic situations in business, family life, and personal growth, the characters, company, and events are imagined. The financial processes, governance procedures, and custody elements are simplified to serve the narrative and are not presented as legal, financial, or psychological advice. The goal of this content is to explore themes like accountability, resilience, integrity, and personal strength, not to portray real individuals or encourage harmful behavior. If you're facing similar challenges in your own life, it's always important to seek guidance from qualified legal, financial, or mental health professionals. This channel focuses on storytelling that inspires reflection and growth, and we are committed to responsible, respectful content.